Chris Pacia. Thank you for being with us at the Crypto Vigilante. You are our first guest, and I think that there's a lot of merit to having you as our first guest, because for a lot of us in crypto and especially within the Bitcoin forks, we find that BitcoinCash has found itself in the middle of one extreme, which would be the scaling methodology of BTC, and the other extreme, which would be the more status approach of SV. So during the Anarcho-Pulco conference, you and I had very good rapport, and I really enjoyed your description of competition versus decentralization. So before we get started, I would like to ask you what your definition of Bitcoin is, and also why you decided to become a developer for BitcoinCash on the protocol level.
Yeah. So a definition of Bitcoin. Thanks for having me, by the way. By way of introduction, how would I define Bitcoin? I'd say it's I think the title of the white paper is pretty good. A peer-to-peer electronic cash. It's a decentralized money is kind of how I would define it, or a protocol for creating decentralized money. As far as BCH goes, I mean, I've been in Bitcoin from I don't know, early 2012 probably is as far back as I go in terms of like active participation. And, you know, like a lot of people were kind of disillusioned with the scaling debate and all of this stuff. And it just didn't seem like the Bitcoin core people, and we call them now maximalists and all of this, the small blockers it didn't seem like they were being rational, right? That, I mean, we share a lot of the same goals. I don't think our end goal, or at least at the time, I don't think our end goals were terribly different. Like, we want to see a decentralized system of money. Like, none of us wanted to see it be, centralized or subject to, extreme amounts of centralization pressure. But just the approach that the Bitcoin core people were taking it came across as like very anti-scientific. Like insisting that 2 megabyte blocks are, like the end of the world, basically.
Yeah, and I've seen your commentary on SegWit, so maybe if you can pepper that in somewhere, because I know that you during the 2x back then, you were in favor of the 2x approach, and then when Amari came out with the ABC BitcoinCash fork, you were like, well, this is the way. And then I met you in person in Japan at the Satoshi Vision conference, and for all of our audience, by far, I would have to say that your speech was the best. It was very anarchistic. It stood out from the crowd, and I'm always going to remember that. That was a really awesome speech that you gave. And so the SegWit approach, what did you see SegWit to be at the time, and has it turned out to be what you expected?
Yeah, it's basically what I expected. It was, I didn't really have a whole lot of a problem with the goals of what SegWit was trying to solve, which was primarily fixed malleability. There was some other stuff in SegWit that wasn't bad, such as fixing the quadratic, or was pretty good, like fixing the quadratic hashing issue, which BCH has adopted. So, there are a couple parts of the SegWit that we have adopted. But the main part of it was to fix the transaction malleability. They wanted to do it as a soft fork. And this just lent itself to kind of a very ugly protocol design. Like the Bitcoin protocol is a pretty, elegant design, fairly simplistic. And SegWit adds a ton of complexity on top of it that just frankly didn't seem necessary. Like you could achieve the same thing with a hard fork, and you would have 100% consensus for it. Even at the time, I said in the Reddit thread where they announced we're doing it. By the way, they just announced they were doing it, right? They didn't they didn't poll people and say like, you know, hey, what's everyone think about this? They just,
well, I don't even know what consensus means to this day. Like no one has been able to define for me what consensus means or how you achieve consensus in crypto.
Yeah, they just said we're doing it, and so on the first thread where they announced it, I was like, wow, okay. And I said, why are you doing it as a soft fork? Because it appears that there's 100% consensus for it. Can't you do it as a hard fork and it would be like 1,000,000 times cleaner? And you know, it was just hand waving, and we don't want to do hard forks, and like basically the response that I got was, if it's technically possible to do it as a soft fork, you should always do it as a soft fork, no matter what. But that doesn't seem like a great, a great approach to me, because these soft forks, they add a lot of technical debt. They can be very convoluted and complicated. For example, I had to rip SegWit out of the BCHd code base. BCHd is a full node for BitcoinCash.
Right.
Worked it from BTCD. The other Bitcoin Cash implementations, both ABC and Bitcoin Unlimited, they forked before SegWit was added. They forked the code base, I should say, before SegWit was added. I forked a code base after SegWit was added, and I had to remove all the SegWit stuff. And it was like half the code base dedicated to SegWit stuff. I mean, everything in the code base had like 2 exit paths. There was like one for regular and one for SegWit, right? Okay. Which just is just a very ugly way of coding things and designing things. From a user perspective, you probably don't notice it a whole lot, but from someone who has to work with the code, this just like feels like you're just piling up the technical debt and taking a relatively elegant protocol and adding a lot of unnecessary complexity, which is primarily why I was opposed to SegWit. Not necessarily the underlying goal of fixing malleability, but just the sheer ugliness of SegWit. And I think BCH is far better off for not having SegWit, because we don't have to deal with all that garbage in the code base.
Well, here, we can take this conversation in 2 different directions. So I'm gonna make pause and put on a tab more of the economic discussion, because you're an Austrian, you have a background in economics, and I would love to talk to you about that in 1 second. And I would like to know your commentary on the removal of the chain of digital signatures within SegWit, and what technical and economic implications that has when you remove it from it being within the same block and moving it to an extended block. In a sense, okay, from a layman's perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as if the chain of digital signatures provides a cryptographic layer of consistency in the transaction history of Bitcoin transactions. And when you remove that onto an extended block, it seems as if you have removed a very important part of the way that wallets are networked within one another.
Well, that's one part I didn't agree with. So there were a lot of people in the BCH community who made that argument, and still I think just about everyone in the BSV community makes that argument. I never found that to be terribly compelling. The reason being that there's 0 lines of code in the code base dedicated to checking the chain of digital signatures. And so I realized the white paper says we define a Bitcoin as a chain of digital signatures, but I kind of take that as sort of a very just high level description for like someone who has no idea what this is, because that's not how it was actually implemented in code. In code, there's this UTXO approach where a Bitcoin is defined as an entry in this UTXO database in code. And so there's no code related to actually checking the chain of digital signatures. So I can't see that as being a very critical part of a system. If there's no code to actually check it, then nothing actually makes use of that. As far as the commitments go, I mean, the signatures are still they're still committed to the block, right? It's just in a different spot. The commitments are, so it's just like restructuring the links on the chain and just shuffling them around a little bit, but they're still chained together. So to me, that wasn't the big issue with SegWit. SegWit was just more about the ugly design and the technical debt that it creates.
Okay. See, that's very interesting that it seems as if you particularly and Bitcoin Cash in general, you guys tend to hold, well, Bitcoin Cash tends to hold a middle ground, and it's in that calibration that we find a lot of almost fascination with what you guys are doing. So beyond the technical question, let's move on to more of the economic one.
Sure.
In regards to any like software upgrades or scaling, any proposals, what would you say to the phrase, the developer proposes, the miner disposes? In other words, shouldn't SegWit have been something for miners to choose out of their own autonomy, whether to add to mine SegWit blocks or not?
Well, they ultimately did. I mean, SegWit, any software can be imposed on the network with only the consent of the miners. The hard forks require the consent of the user base too, which is why I kind of like the hard fork approach better. I mean, there's more of a risk of a chain split with a hard fork, which is what like the BTC people are trying to avoid by doing everything as a soft fork. Like they're trying to avoid a scenario where a percentage of users say, I don't want that, and then they keep the old chain alive, which is basically what happened with BSV and BCH, you know, the chain split in two. But the opposite side of that is it's like almost more authoritarian to do it that way, because it's like you're saying, we don't want a percentage of our users like refusing an upgrade. So we're going to do the upgrade in a way that forces it on them, and they have no choice but to use it. Which is
of the throwing here, let me just throw this in there. The fact that we haven't really faced, would you say, I mean, from my perspective, it seems as if we are still in the position, all three chains, where we are not in dire economic pressure. And I think we're going to maybe start seeing more of that after May 2020, when the halving happens again, right? What, you know, when you foresee, you know, let's take your argument to the logical conclusion of finding itself in the midst of a lot of economic pressure, where miners have to monetize, right? What then? Would you still have the same opinion that the idea that all users should have the same voice as users, as in having the same equitable distribution of quote unquote rights to choose? Or would you, or under extreme economic pressure, would you say, well, actually there are players that have more at stake, right, per se, right? More riding on the line? In my personal opinion, Chris, I think that miners are the players that have the most to lose, right? They have they hold the investment class that is less liquid in the market, right? If I have coin, I can sell it. If I have a business, I can pivot it. But if I own ASIC miners, they only serve the purpose of mining Bitcoin, and I have a choice of one of these three chains. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, because we are yet to know what the market will decide under economic pressure. But I would like to know more of what your perspective is in terms of how you foresee actors behaving under intense economic pressure.
Well, in economic pressure, you just mean like the block reward going down and the
yes. So
power going down.
Yeah, for a long time, right? We have been depending on the block reward as the means by which miners capitalize, right? That's been the main approach, right? And we've always thought about transaction fees as something out in the distant future. But what if that distant future accelerates? As we know, this grows exponentially. What if that economic pressure accelerates? Then the miner needs to monetize and seek profit in the best means possible, and a miner cannot afford to mine at a loss more than, let's say, BSV miners are mining right now, right? Or BCH miners have mined at a loss, or even BTC miners when they've been under economic pressure, right?
Well, so what's the solution? I mean, the only real solution I see is just to gain more users and more adoption.
what is the BCH approach? What's the Bitcoin Cash approach to win over this class of investors that arguably are the most important class of investors, the miners themselves?
Oh, to get more mining power? So it's just, my view is the mining power just follows the price, right? That as the price goes up, more people mine. As it goes down, less people mine. I don't even necessarily view miners as being particularly invested in a single chain, especially with multiple coins using SHA-256. They just bounce around from whatever's more profitable at the time. So I see like the long-term survival as requiring essentially more usage, that you have to have, I'm under the view that usage is ultimately what's going to drive price in the end, that the main driver of price today is mostly speculation, but I don't view that as particularly sustainable, that we're going to have to transition towards more genuine usage, otherwise the system fails.
Right.
So we have to have more usage, and with that more usage comes both a higher price and more transaction fees for the miners. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. Now, like, how do you see something like you're an Avalanche developer right now? You're working on Avalanche. How's that going? And how do you see that? How do you see the innovation of Avalanche as a pre-consensus protocol on top of the mining protocol within Bitcoin? How do you see that in any way shaping the incentive structure of mining? Do you see it at all shaping the incentive structure of mining, or?
Well, it kind of depends on how it's implemented. Kind of what it says is like, if a majority of miners vote for a transaction, well, so there are different ways it can be implemented. And one way is like, essentially miners have kind of like an initial vote, and whichever side, like yes or no for a particular transaction, and whichever side comes down in the majority will usually be the side that comes to a consensus, right? So that everyone following this protocol comes to a consensus that, like, yes, this transaction should be included in the chain, or no, it shouldn't be included in the chain. That's one way to implement Avalanche. And in that sense, it probably does defer to majority opinion of the miners, more so than the existing system does, right? I mean, the existing system already says that the majority of miners can basically impose their definition of a valid transaction on the network, or at least can restrict the definition of a valid transaction via just orphaning the minority chain, right? They just, basically this is would be like a 51% attack. If miners sort of banded together and said, we're going to reject blocks that don't follow this more stricter set of rules, that's a soft fork. That's I know you could maybe call it a 51% attack. Avalanche kind of does the same thing. It says we're going to restrict we have the broader set of valid transactions. We're going to restrict that according to what the majority of miners agree to. But it's not like orphaning whole blocks, right? It's or I guess it would be technically orphaning blocks, but it's like a protocol to agree, so it doesn't have to come down to orphaning blocks to do that, right? You can agree essentially in advance.
So how is okay. So where is Avalanche right now in its development?
It's still super early. I mean, there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on it really at all. It's just been mostly just me and Amaury. That's the only people who have worked on it.
Okay.
And I put up kind of a little website that I had running for a little while that showed, Avalanche running. It wasn't enforced as a consensus rule. These were just nodes that were simulating Avalanche, what it would look like if it were running on the network as a consensus rule. I think the main problem, parameters that need to be defined, and a lot of trade-offs, an awful lot of trade-offs. And it's kind of hard to pick the correct set of trade-offs, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, in my opinion, I think it requires a lot more people than just Amaury and me looking at this set of trade-offs and trying to figure out what the optimal set is. Like, we could pick something, but there's no guarantee that what we pick would be optimal. So it requires a lot more people than just the two of us working on it. And I haven't worked on it for a few months now. I know kind of where we left off is my implementation was putting a signature on every single network message, which was very resource intensive. And a better way of doing that would be to have a pre-negotiated handshake and then do something like a stream cipher or something like this. Would be a lot less resource intensive. So Amaury was kind of looking at exploring different encryption techniques that could be used for this. They use something called, what the name of it currently escapes me, but the Lightning Network implemented some kind of encryption package that for their thing that maybe it's something that we could look into using. I hate to like have a custom rolled, like home rolled encryption scheme the way they did it, but that in terms of like our needs and our use cases, that might be what we have to go to. But so, I mean, that's like kind of very basic, right? Like if we're just talking about how do nodes communicate with each other, we haven't even really gotten into what are they communicating, right?
Okay. So it's still a work in progress, and I've seen you comment on Schnorr signatures being implemented in this past May 15th of BitcoinCash. And so, come again, what are the wallets that are implementing it right now?
I'm not really sure. I think Electron Cash has it in maybe in a beta form. I think I may have jumped the gun slightly in implementing it in I have a beta wallet that's on Android called Neutrino that has some really advanced technology in it. And I implemented Schnorr signatures in that. And I probably pushed that too early because I think my home node is the only node on the network that currently accepts Schnorr signatures into the mempool. So like if I turn off my laptop, I think that wallet will stop working. So we have to put out like a new release and try and get people to upgrade or roll back the wallet to use regular signatures in the meantime, but we'll see. Okay,
so you don't see Bitcoin Cash competing with Monero on the privacy sector?
No, not directly. I mean, Monero is at like the protocol layer. I think, the problem is, I mean, we already have some scalability challenges with the system as a whole. And what Monero does just makes the scalability challenges that much worse. Kind of same thing with Zcash. And it would be great if, like right now, am I mute? No. Right now, there's a trade-off between that privacy technology and the scalability of the system. The more private you make it tends to be the less scalable it becomes. And, so it's a question of, we're kind of very, I don't really want to say skeptical, but very conservative in terms of doing things that are going to harm scalability of it, like pushing more in the Monero direction.
Scalability in what aspect? Technical or economic?
No, technical. Like Monero consumes, to run a node, it consumes far more resources than running a Bitcoin node does.
Right.
Zcash, same way, just because of the enhanced cryptography in it. You look at something like, I know people looked at like Grin and they were like, oh, here's an example of something that has strong privacy and it's more scalable. I think that was like false advertising. I think even Grin is less scalable than Bitcoin is, just simply due to the amount of resources that is needed to run a node. It's just kind of like a middle ground privacy, maybe between Bitcoin on one side and like maybe Monero on the other. Something like Grin is maybe. So from our perspective, it's if you can put like push the privacy stuff off onto kind of like, hate to use the term like layer 2, but like something like a cash shuffle which is like a CoinJoin type implementation that's not implemented necessarily at the protocol level, but it's something optional where it's an optional coin mixer that people can push their coins through. Something like that can be beneficial. Cash Shuffle's not completely perfect, but it probably is the best coin mixing solution that we've had to date. And so I don't know if the technology improves and like the cryptography improves and you know, we might consider adding like more privacy type features in the future, but I don't think the technology where it's at today is exactly where we would want it to be.
Okay. Yeah. So right now it seems as if Bitcoin Cash is still on the same path of being money for the world and is implementing privacy features. Do you see these privacy features at all getting in the way of achieving that goal for money for the world?
Well, yeah, like I just said, if it's at the protocol level, it can potentially make the system less scalable, which is why we haven't done anything at the protocol level yet. And it's not clear that we ever will unless these technologies improve in terms of, you know, just how good they're getting and this sort of stuff. I do think the technology is going to improve and there's going to be kind of breakthroughs in cryptography and this sort of stuff. I kind of doubt that what we have today is always going to be the state of the art forever in terms of blockchain design. So it wouldn't surprise me to see some super advanced like moon math cryptography that can do like ultra scalable systems without any linkage between transactions in the blockchain. That would kind of be ideal.
Okay, right on. Chris, this past May, we had the Bitcoin Cash fork upgrade. We had some blocks that were orphaned, and there was a lot of news about it. What happened? If you can give us a perspective on what occurred, and yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, we had this upgrade on May 15th that added Schnorr signatures. Unbeknownst to us as developers, there was a bug in the Bitcoin ABC client implementation, which is primarily the one that miners use to mine Bitcoin Cash with. A couple miners use other implementations like, well, primarily Bitcoin Unlimited, but most of the miners are using Bitcoin ABC. And there was a bug in the ABC implementation that existed for probably around like 6 months, that if you broadcast certain types of transactions, you could cause some errors in the miners like mempool that would prevent them from mining blocks containing transactions. And so rather than like disclose this responsibly and you know, like people should when they find a bug, someone decided to try and exploit the bug to attack the chain and tried to do it right at the point where Bitcoin Cash was having the hard fork, you know, the upgrade, to try and you know, have like maximum confusion on the network. The bug was unrelated to the actual hard fork, but they decided to exploit it right at that time to try to you know, cause Bitcoin Cash to really take a big dive. You know, the end result was, you know, the ABC developers fixed the bug within like an hour. I think they had a patch out in like 40 minutes from the first block that was mined without transactions. So the network went maybe about like an hour and 10 minutes without any transactions mined. Transactions could have been mined during that 10 minutes because the Bitcoin Unlimited client was still operating normally. But the miners who were using Bitcoin Unlimited just didn't get lucky enough to mine a block during that period. But yeah, it went like something like an hour and 10 minutes without mining any transactions. And then, you know, the miners applied the patch and it started working again. Seemed like the attacker, I mean, there was a lot of shorts filed on Bitfinex, someone said like 50 million in shorts. So it looked like people were probably trying to profit from this as well. But, you know, the price of Bitcoin Cash just, you know, went up that day. So it didn't even go down. So it didn't seem like the goal of that attack was really successful. The goal seemed like they were trying to really kind of crash the entire chain, cause a big panic, big sell-off, and that didn't really happen. So, I mean, we kind of dodged a little bit of a bullet there. In terms of severity of bugs, it could have been more severe. There was some 2-block reorg that I don't really know the scenarios surrounding that 2-block reorg. Somebody said that what happened was some unknown miner tried mining a bunch of basically stealing. People had sent coins into BitcoinCash blockchain by accident. They were trying to send it to SegWit addresses on the Bitcoin chain, and they sent them to SegWit addresses on the BitcoinCash chain by accident. And so someone was saying that there was a block was trying to steal all of those coins. And so some miner like BTC Top or something like that made a decision to basically orphan that block. And that caused like a 2-block reorg. I don't know if that's what happened or not. It seemed, I would just say if that's what happened, I mean, it seems hard pressed to me that like miners would be watching the contents of every single block that closely and be able to kind of like write code or have systems in place that just allow them to click a button, reorg stuff, right? I don't know. Maybe they do have that. I don't know if they do or not, but it just seems kind of like that would have been very complex to do if it was an intentional decision to reorg those or to orphan that block. But I don't know what happened there.
Okay. All right. So I think kind of like the last topic that I would like to talk to you is more theoretical, kind of going back to our conversation in Acapulco. And I really would like to, for people to hear what you have to say. I thought it was very insightful when you mentioned the distinction between competition and decentralization. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it seems as if the majority of crypto focuses on decentralization as the end goal. Mm-hmm. And recently I tweeted to Fluffy Pony, oh yay, central planners for decentralization, kind of poking at him, but he liked it and he thought it was a cool comment, but I was actually being a little bit, I was trying to go for a low blow, but he didn't get it. But this thing, man, of where is the top down, right? Some people would say that the top down and what is the bottom up approach in crypto, right? Mm-hmm. And some people have arguments in saying that if you give miners too much autonomy, then miners end up having a top down approach of governance, right? Yeah. And that same argument would say, well, that's why we need community consensus. But as stated earlier, to this day, I don't even know how the hell they reach that consensus. Mm. And so the only thing I can think of is like, well, we have designated central planners for sake of decentralization. Okay, and then the other argument for it would be that the actual bottom-up approach would be that of the free market as signaled by the miners, who are the people that have the most to lose given any economic pressure. So in your perspective right now, what is bottom-up and what is top-down when it comes to crypto?
Well, there's probably a bunch of different contexts we could use those phrases, but in terms of how the interaction between like the miners and the nodes and as it relates to competition. So I wrote this, I made a comment the other day on Reddit where I wrote this. Maybe I'll write into a formal blog post one day, but like, so here's imagine a hypothetical world where you have only miners are the only ones running full nodes. For whatever reason, either end users just decide not to run it, or maybe because it takes Facebook scale infrastructure to run a full node and no one can afford it except for the miners. So the end result of that is the only ones checking the work and basically double checking the work or validating the work of miners is going to be other miners. And so the concern is what happens if those miners basically band together, or a majority of them band together and say, okay, let's change the rules and let's increase the, increase the inflation rate and pay us more money, right? Now, if the miners are the only ones fully validating the transactions, this potentially will go completely unnoticed, right? If you increase the inflation rate by 1%, it's not like anyone's really going to notice, but they're going to make a lot more money, these miners. So the response to that, I think from people like Craig Wright, is I think there's two responses. They say, one, mining is competitive, so this would never happen, right? Or that like this would require a cartel, and cartels are not possible in a free market. I think this is a really bad argument for a variety of reasons. One is that cartels do form in a free market. They just tend to fall apart over time due to bad internal incentives, right? Like they come to an agreement, like we're all going to raise prices, and then over time, like some of them start saying, well, if I give like off-book deals to my customers with lower prices, I can actually take customers away from the other cartel members and make more money. And it's through like bad internal incentives like that over time the cartel falls apart.
Right, Chris. But wouldn't you say that that present value would go against the incentive of the miner's future profit? Right.
Well, we don't know that because so that's the second argument that the Craig and his like make is they say, well, it's not in the miner's interest to do so. This would make Bitcoin less valuable as a whole, but that needs to be buffered against the fact that they're printing money out of thin air, right? So yes, Bitcoin could be less valuable as a whole, but maybe the extra money that they're printing out of thin air might more than make up for it. We don't really know.
That would destroy the chain. I mean, if
no, not really. If you had like 1% extra inflation, or you went from a 12.5 block reward to a 25 or a 50 block reward, I don't think that would destroy the chain at all. I think it would keep functioning. And miners would clearly make more money from doing so. It's just a question of whether Bitcoin as a whole would be worth less, including the extra money that the miners would making. So that's a net plus for them. I don't think we know if it's a net plus for them or not.
Chris, do you think that's even feasible to happen for miners to just, let's say BSV, the BSV mindset regarding mining, has a fair shot in the market and it just grows, and in the future we have miners with this temptation, right, of forming a cartel, right? I at this moment I can't see people not keeping an ear to the ground as to what the miners are doing. Because if that would be the case, then these guys, the miners themselves would be the most important entities in crypto. I mean, we are talking about an argument that comes from a miner maximalist perspective, right? And that miner maximalist perspective is based on a meritocracy where their incentive is to secure the market, right? Is to insecure.
Well, I don't know that. So first off, you're talking about, I
just don't see the miners being able to just act without any community oversight. I think there's always going to be some community.
Well, that's where the full nodes. That's where the full nodes come in, and the ability to run a full node and have people in the economy fully validating these transactions is very important. Because, for example, let's say right now the miners, they mine coins, they take them to an exchange and they sell it. If the exchanges are not validating the work the miners did, they might just accept those coins from the miners and say, okay, we'll take your coins, here's the dollars, go have a nice time. And those coins could be invalid according to the consensus rules. This is why, like, exchanges, for example, if they fully validate those transactions, they would say, oh, wait a second, these coins they're trying to give me are not valid. Okay, so the miners, knowing that if I inflate the money supply and then I try and sell those coins off to people, I'm not going to find a buyer for them because other people are going to detect that those coins are invalid and they're not going to accept them. Okay, so it's pretty crucial for some members of the economy to have that ability to fully validate transactions. I don't think that it requires everyone to run a full node, right? BTC people would say, well, this is why we need 100% of the economy running a full node.
Right.
I don't think that you need 100%, or maybe I'm exaggerating slightly. Luke Jr. says 70%. Okay, so he says 70% of the economy needs to be running a full node. I think that even that's way more because we don't have 70% running full nodes today, and yet I don't think anyone would say Bitcoin's insecure because of that. So, but I do think, I think 0% running a full node or 0% outside of the miners, I think is really distorting the incentives in a way that are very dangerous because now
I agree.
Taking away that oversight.
I think that even, I mean, so I think even people in BSV would say that it's important to oversee what the miners are doing. Their best argument would be, well, we trust the free market. We trust the forces of the market, and we know that the miner would never operate in a way that is counterproductive to the entire economy.
Yeah, I mean, that's their argument. Now, what I would say in response to that is, and I don't mean to necessarily quote the white paper like constantly, because that's like the BSV thing, but it does say, we propose a system based on cryptographic proof rather than trust.
Right.
You just kind of described where we're just going to trust miners are going to follow this incentives that we think they have. We don't know 100% for sure, but we think that their incentive is not to print money. But our system is going to be built on this trust that they're just going to do that. That's building a system based on trust, not based on cryptographic proof, right? That's completely the opposite of what literally it was proposed in the white paper to be, is a system based on cryptographic proof rather than based on trust. And that proof exists when you're doing the full validation. When you stop doing that full validation, now you transition to a system based on trust and hope that people that the incentives work out properly, which again, I don't think we know that it even would, because yes, I would expect if the miners inflated the money supply, I would expect Bitcoin probably to be worth less, but I'd also expect the miners to make more money just because they're printing it. So it's not clear to me that it's a net loss for the miner in that scenario. And it also depends on what their discount rate is too, because if you have a very low discount rate, then that strategy might be unprofitable. If the miners have a very high discount rate, it might be a profitable strategy.
Right.
So
the okay, so patterns of behavior over time, right? BSV is very new. Heck, I personally think everything's very new in crypto. But we've started to see patterns of behavior over time that indicate different philosophies of what is appropriate for a crypto governance within Bitcoin, right? And we see we have three different main modalities of having this crypto governance. So we've already talked about the approach of keeping miners accountable, right? Especially when within the crowd that is a miner maximalist, like the Bitcoin SV crowd, right? And yeah, I would say that even an entrepreneur or a big investor in BSV would definitely want to keep tabs on making sure that the miners are not becoming a cartel, because I mean it's even within the mindset within BSV to have a stable protocol. But moving further beyond BSV, what would you say is let's talk about BTC. What would be BTC's approach then to making sure that, what is their bottom-up mindset? Their bottom-up mindset would be they're scared of mining decentralization as well. And so their bottom-up approach is to give the community power to reach this sort of consensus. And
no, so I really don't think they have a particularly good approach. So they have a very centralized approach to development. So remember in BTC, they only have a handful of people who get like final say into what goes into Bitcoin and what doesn't. It's just the nature of how software development, open source software development works, is every software project has either a dictator or a group of dictators, right? That's just how software development works. It's a hierarchical structure. And it's hierarchical now based on social conventions and software development, open source development. Generally speaking, the amount of say that you get is proportionate to how much you contribute to that particular software project. Right. But not always, but still it's kind of a hierarchical scenario, a situation where you end up with just a few people who have a huge amount of say, and you have a ton of people who have no say at all. And the alternative, if you don't like the direction they're taking the project in open source development, is your scenario is to fork the software and put out your own version.
Necessarily, Chris? I mean, the other approach would be to have a hash war, right? And for miners to decide.
Well, that requires forking the software at minimum, right? You're not going to get the changes that you want into that version, that repo, right? Like
Sure. Let me give you an example. Like, and you were there, right? When BitcoinCash forked from BTC, many within BitcoinCash were of the mindset, some of them before the actual fork happened, between the 2x period and BitcoinCash forking, right around that timeline, there are people talking about staying within BTC, but for there to be a contingent of miners that would orphan SegWit transactions, blocks that contain SegWit transactions.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't a serious proposal, but a couple of people did propose it. But going back to what I was saying, so in open source software development, you'll see where I'm going with this. If whoever controls the repo, right, the repo where the code is, if they're just being shitlords and refusing to, or if they're running the project in ways that you feel is detrimental, you can fork the code base and put out your own version of the code and encourage people to use your version instead of the other version. What happened in BTC was they made it explicitly known that if you do that, they are going to viciously attack you, right? That they are going to marshal every, unethical tactic they have under their belts, from hacking attacks to death threats to giant social media propaganda campaigns. They're going to trash your name all over the place. They're going to vilify you, make you public enemy number one.
Right.
And they're going to do everything in their power to prevent you from taking away users from the one true repo, right? The GitHub repo, the GitHub Bitcoin repo. That is controlled by the current crop of core developers, right? So it's through that process that they basically maintain their monopoly. So normally, yes, you would have a scenario in which if you don't like what they're doing, you could fork it, but people who tried that were viciously attacked.
Right.
And now no one in their right mind would try that again, right? Who wants to go through that, especially when you can create your own coin, you can do whatever you want. So they've more or less...
But you won't have the same network of investors, though.
No, but I don't think people are going to want to subject themselves to that again. And like they've seen what happens. I mean, it was extreme what the core people did.
I know.
Even to this day, they still call people who participated in SegWit 2x, they're still calling them attackers. They're still calling them corporate shills.
I have a good friend of mine, a personal anecdote, right? That he was contributing to Bitcoin in 2013, 2012, and he was bullied so bad that he literally left crypto altogether.
Yeah. I'm sure there were.
It was awful. I mean, right, wrong, or indifferent, what occurred was awful.
Yeah. But my point is that because of that, now they have a monopoly, and that monopoly is as close to being entrenched as you're going to get, because the word is out. If you try and compete against their monopoly, this is what's going to happen to you. So because of that, they have extremely centralized development. And when you combine that with a view of we have to make changes by soft fork, which, remember, soft forks are basically like developer sanctioned 51% attacks. It's basically saying like when it came to SegWit, take SegWit as an example, like they didn't have anywhere close to consensus in the community for SegWit.
Right.
They'll try and tell you today they did, but no, they had, I think, less than a majority of people actually supported SegWit. And it was like 5% of the miners who actually did. So they had a very small percentage or less than a majority that were actually supporting it. But their mentality was like, it doesn't matter because we only need like 3 or 4 mining pools to run our software, and we can just ram SegWit down everyone's throat.
Yeah, at Vigilante, we followed closely the development of SegWit, and I still remember how slow SegWit was adopted by the community.
Yeah, but like I think their view was like, it doesn't matter if like the community doesn't like our proposal because we can just ram it down their throats anyway, so long as we can get like whatever it was, 70% of the miners to agree to it, we can just ram it down everyone's throats. Or I should, not just 70% of the miners, 70% of the pools, which amounts to maybe like 5 or 6 people, right? So it's like, if we can get those 5 or 6 people that control 70% of the hash rate, we can just ram it down people's throats regardless of whether they like it or not. And so that's basically like the BTC approach to development. Now they go on and they pretend like they have this decentralized open source, like, Adam Back said, we have like an, IETF, process similar to the IETF for development. That's all bullshit, right? It's just a facade of decentralization to hide the fact that the system is actually heavily centralized into the hands of a few people. Now, the fact that those few people don't make very many changes very often. I mean, it's been what, like 2.5 years since SegWit or something like that. Is that, or a year and a half? I don't know how long it's been, but
2017.
Yeah, so we're coming up on 2 years. So, and they still, I mean, that was like the last change they made to Bitcoin, right? So I think it's the fact that they don't make changes very often that allows them to say, like, see, it's decentralized, right? But like, if they had another event like SegWit where they were going to ram it down the throats despite the fact that people disagreed with it, and it would just give the lie to that notion that their system is very decentralized. Right.
So how is Bitcoin Cash different then? Because there's been criticism that Bitcoin Cash, checkpointed with exchanges, that there was not the hash. We didn't allow the miners to figure it out, and that by not allowing the miners to figure it out on their own, there is the argument out there that Bitcoin Cash acted in a similar way to Core.
Well, I mean, right off the bat, I think there's a big difference in there, and that no one's going to viciously attack someone for forking the code base or starting an alternative node implementation or anything like that. I mean, I've started one called BCHd, and, I just got a lot of praise from the existing group of developers. I didn't, it wasn't like people went out to destroy me because I started a BCHd full node implementation. And there's Bitcoin Unlimited is another one. So there's a culture in which it's acceptable to have multiple implementations. And in fact, that's encouraged. And forking the code base and starting new implementations is encouraged in Bitcoin Cash, where it's extremely discouraged in Bitcoin BTC. So that's a big difference. But I would also say I really like, there was an article by Rick Falkvinier.
Yeah, he has good videos. I just recently watched his second, his third video that he recently put out on the Lightning Network. That was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, those videos are okay, but he wrote this article when Bitcoin Cash first came out. This was November 12th, 2017, and he titled it "A Statement from the CEO of Bitcoin Cash," and it was a tongue-in-cheek statement because he was trying to make a point that there are no like leaders in this type of system, and so he's like, I'm just going to call myself CEO, but it's a meaningless title.
Right.
But he does have a very good. He has a section in here on like how we make protocol changes, or how we do development. And let me just find that section real quick. He says,
yeah, how do you? I mean, because of course we already know the Bitcoin Core approach.
Yeah. So here it is. He says, dispute resolution. He says we circumvent the need for one. Now, granted, this is Rick's interpretation. This is not like an official Bitcoin Cash, statement or whatever. But I mean, I happen to agree with this. He says, I propose we use the swarm methodology for dispute resolution, which is optimized for our kind of disorganization. It simply means that nobody gets to say when anyone else gets to do or not do, and it carries immense power. We have been conditioned in the corporate world to think that power over feature X for ourselves also means power over feature X for other people. But when we break free from this idea, we have a much better dispute resolution than any voting or decree ruling that is based on these 4 simple principles. And these 4 principles are: everyone is free to take any initiative for Bitcoin Cash they want. Everyone is free to follow any initiative taken by any person. Everyone is free to take no action at all. However, no one else may tell anyone else what to do or what initiative to take or not take or follow to not follow. So basically, it's a decentralized to the extreme in the sense that you follow whatever protocol rules you find valuable, right? Or you follow any initiatives that you find valuable, or you run any software that you find valuable. Now, some people are going to say, well, that sounds like that's going to result in disagreements that could possibly result in like a fork in the chain, where some people end up forking away or following a different set of rules than everyone else. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen. But what's the alternative? The alternative is we force our views on other people who don't consent to it, right? So it's like, once you operate in this mentality that the only people who are running our software are people who consent to it, like once you realize that, it creates a purely voluntary system, that the only people following the chain are people who have bought in and adopted it and are genuinely interested in using it. Like, we're not trying to force a particular set of consensus rules on people who don't want it. Okay, that
so
people
if you don't agree with those consensus rules, do the rules that you run, do they get orphaned, or what happens if
you can create a different? I mean, BSV exists because a set of people didn't have that ability, right? Like, if we were genuinely behaving in an authoritarian manner, BSV would not exist today. Right, we would just force the BSV people to just submit to us. Right.
So if this swarm approach, what is the oracle here? What is the who decides at the end? Right.
We don't need a decider. That's the point. That everyone decides for themselves, and that is what forms consensus. Right. The consensus is the individual decision making among users. Now, maybe that breaks into several different consensuses, right, or several different chains, several different coins. That's fine. I tend to think over time, one chain or one rule set or one set of rules is going to be proved to be more valuable than others. And there's going to be less incentive to follow other chains as a result of that. In the short run, there's probably not that much of a difference, but in the long run, I expect there to be less incentive to break away from what everyone else is following and go at someone else. And there's going to start to be like a kind of a strong social consensus built around the particular rule set, and kind of a strong presumption against breaking from that rule set and going in a different direction. Now, like, I think that's kind of maybe where, like, I kind of see this a little bit with the BSV people, in that they say, like, the Bitcoin rule set, that's it. It's the best. It shouldn't change. And there's this strong presumption against breaking from the original rule set in version 0.1. And I can at least
methodology to development. Yes.
I mean, I can at least understand that. I think it's way too early to make that claim, right? I think that it's not like there's one coin with, like, the current Bitcoin rule set has 95% market share, and we're talking about breaking away from that and going to someone that has a tiny little bit of market share. We're talking about, like, the market share is very shattered right now. It's very split across many, many different coins. And I think we're still figuring out what that particular rule set is, right? And I don't think there's any guarantee that original Bitcoin 0.1 rule set is it. Or do I think the Bitcoin Cash rule set is it, or the BTC rule set is it? I think we're still in the process of figuring this out.
Right.
And I think we're going to figure it out by seeing what's more valuable over time.
I agree with you. And I'm really happy you brought in the notion of what is more valuable over time. And if maybe you can explain how the economic incentives tie into the Bitcoin Cash swarm consensus gathering approach. Because I mean, I think we how are incentives aligned? How do incentives become aligned in moving? I see the merit that you mentioned of having the option to opt in or opt out of a given implementation or proposal within Bitcoin Cash, but what is it that what is the economic driver here that incentivizes a particular implementation to be the new implementation of rules or whatever within Bitcoin Cash? What is the incentive?
Well, I think anyone who holds the coin wants to see that coin be as valuable as possible, right? It's like you own shares in Uber. You want to see Uber become as valuable as possible, and thus Uber needs to implement policies and features that are going to make it used by as many people as possible, right?
Is there a way to get feedback from the market as to what incentivizes people the most within Bitcoin Cash?
Well, I'd say price and usage are probably the two biggest feedbacks, right? I don't know what other it would be. I mean,
what would be the determining factor, though, or the determining actors that decide that given implementation will be the implementation that corresponds best to market demand?
Okay, so the current process is, we discuss this, as developers across the different implementations. We do have our cross-implementation development calls and this sort of stuff. People make proposals. They're evaluated. People some proposals have more support than others, and there's a fair amount of disagreement. And then it's, at the end of the day, someone has to go off and implement, and you have to decide, okay, for me in my implementation, am I going to follow this or am I not going to follow this? Am I going to split off or am I not going to split off?
So it's something that happens in a committee meeting, and then in a committee type environment of developers, and then that is proposed or executed in the market. And if you wanted to follow it, you can follow it. If not, you don't have to. Is that pretty much what you're saying?
Yeah, basically it. And then same thing for, users. If you want to follow those changes, uninstall your current software and install the new software. If you don't want to follow those changes, stick with the original software. If there's
where do miners fall into place in this process within Bitcoin Cash?
I think miners just are going to mine whatever's profitable, and they're going to mine it in proportion to price, right? So, okay. If there's a split and it's 50-50, then half the mining power goes on one side, half goes on the other. If it's 90-10, 90% goes on one side, 10% goes on the other.
So during these meetings, is that like a very significant part of your conversation within Bitcoin Cash? Is the conversation, does it revolve around how do we make sure that the chain is secure by incentivizing miners the best? How does is that part of the conversation?
Again, because I think miners are only going to mine what's profitable for them.
Right. So do you guys talk about we think this will be most profitable and would there's miners to the chain?
Well, I think there's an overwhelming consensus among developers that Bitcoin Cash, we need it to just work and work really well and kind of do one thing really well, and that's just process transactions fast and cheaply, right? And I think that's the overwhelming drive there, is that that's the main value proposition of Bitcoin Cash, and that's the one thing that we want to keep it working, processing transactions.
There's still emphasis to be in Ethereum number 2, with the implementation of Omni and having, you know what I mean, in implementing smart contracts on top of.
No, I don't know if that was ever a priority of anyone. So there was a proposal to do tokens on Bitcoin Cash natively that didn't, basically the BU developers proposed it and the ABC developers said, we don't like it, we're not going to implement it. And then the BU developers they could have pushed it and they could have said, well, we're doing it regardless of what you think. But the BU developers just kind of gave up on it at that point. So they didn't push it. But the end result of that was someone developed another protocol called SLP, the Simple Ledger Protocol, which is just an op return-based token system that's pretty decent. The SLP is not, it doesn't require consensus changes to do it, and it works fairly well. I don't really have any problem with how the SLP is working, but that's just a generic token solution, not like an Ethereum type system.
Okay.
I don't think so. There was that wormhole proposal, but I think that just came from people in China. I didn't know anyone personally who was working on wormhole. There was a lot of propaganda from Craig Wright saying like, we're making all these changes to support wormhole and we're trying to like make it into the wormhole chain and all of this. No one in Bitcoin Cash development was working on wormhole. We're partnering with anyone working on wormhole. We're making changes for people working on wormhole. And like wormhole was like completely separate project that the only reason people thought that it had something to do with Bitcoin Cash development was because Craig Wright told people it did when it didn't. And you know, today, I don't know what happened to wormhole. I think it's completely dead. I think the people who were working on it, I don't know if they were getting funds from Bitmain or what the deal is, but I thought I heard the funds dried up and that's it for the project. So, and it's not because like, you know, we either did make changes to the protocol or we didn't make changes to the protocol. It's just because the people who were working on it stopped working on it, right?
Right. Okay, Chris, I think maybe a last question here, and maybe we can come back to it in some other conversation. And as our listeners know, I've been a little more partial to the SV approach, and our business, my business partner, Mr. X, he's been more partial to the BTC approach. So it's really awesome to talk to you, Chris, and give us the perspective of Bitcoin Cash. And so as Bitcoin is complicated in itself and something that you never stop learning about because there's so many aspects, it's interdisciplinary, there's just so many things to learn about Bitcoin. Before the call, I told you that what my current definition of Bitcoin was. And since we started off with yours, I'll give you mine again, which is that I see Bitcoin as a network of miners because eventually, like we've stated throughout our conversation, miners are those who are incentivized to secure the network. Miners are those who are incentivized to protect the network, and they are the ones that have the most to lose if something were to go wrong with the network, because they have the asset class that is least liquid. ASIC SHA-256 miners are just for mining Bitcoin, and so.
Well, what would you say to someone who says, I can find a miner who has $5 million invested, but then I can point to just a straight holder who doesn't own any mining power who has $100 million invested? Are you gonna say that miner with 5 million has more to lose than the holder with 100 million? Invested in mining equipment? Yeah.
Well, I mean that's, I would say that's relative to the individual's, own finances, right? So
no.
I mean, yeah, for me, $1 billion may be a lot of money, but for someone,
well, putting aside the interpersonal utility comparison, but just in general, I don't think it's per se always the case that people who are mining have the most to lose. I think someone like Roger Ver, not only does he own a ton of Bitcoin Cash, but he owns a very valuable property, and that is the Bitcoin.com name.
Right.
That
mining equipment.
I'm sure Roger has more overall invested in Bitcoin than a number of miners do.
Right, but
I'm sure he's got more money invested than many miners do.
So I don't know if Roger has a mining operation, but let's say that he also had a mining operation, right? If Bitcoin Cash, or if all of crypto were to go down tomorrow, he could pivot his company to something in fintech, right? So his investment, he could salvage it. The prices,
the domain would be worthless.
The domain, but the company itself, he can pivot it.
Well, most of the value in the company is due to the domain, I think.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about the intricacies of the company, but let's say they're developing and doing research and development on the back end that we may not know about. So he can definitely pivot his company to fintech into something else. He could sell his coin as the price is dropping, right? And pull out into fiat. But the mining equipment itself, if he also owned mining equipment, once the crypto market tanks, those computers are just for the use of mining Bitcoin. I mean, what is he? No one's going to want to buy them. I mean, how does he? That's what I mean by it being the class of the investment class that is least liquid in the market, right?
Yeah, I mean, the equipment's probably less liquid than the tokens, but both are going to go down in proportion to each other.
For sure, but you can definitely sell the token as the price is going down. No one's going to want to buy your mining equipment as the price is going down. That's a difference, right? So in a sense, the miner does, from a miner maximalist perspective, which is the current perspective that I hold, I see mining as being pivotal to all chains, as we've stated throughout the conversation, that miners are not even loyal to any one of the given three chains, right? And that they go back and forth. So given economic pressure in the future, I mean, my question to you is like, what do you foresee happening to BSV, BitcoinCash, and BTC? What is your perspective?
I don't know. I mean, certainly I think we're going to have a big question to ask in terms of, is the level of security that we have enough to secure is enough amount of hashing power we have enough to secure the chain, or does something else need to be done? Because let's say the block reward keeps going down, transaction volume's not going up, price isn't going up. What is going to, are we going to be okay with that and just say, well, the chain technically has less hashing power, but we still feel that it's at least secure enough even with this less hashing power? Maybe that's the case. I don't know. Or are people going to start saying that we need to do something else? Like, for example, Peter Todd has been floating for a while the notion that Bitcoin needs to have a permanent block reward. Instead of having the block reward go to 0, he wants it to go to inflation rate to go to 1% or something.
In other words, Bitcoin won't have the famous 21 million cap, right?
Yeah, I don't
limited in supply anymore.
If it's
weird. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Core is realizing that. I think they're realizing that the block reward is not. They're foreseeing a future where they see the block reward not being enough to incentivize their miners. And what's crazy, Chris, is that when people talk about mining fees, they don't tend to make the distinction between replaced by fees, right, and actual fees that come from legit, valid transactions and transaction volume. Yeah. Right.
Well, here's the thing with mining, though. It's the reward. It's a supply and demand thing, and if your goal is to maximize mining fees to the individual miner, there's a sweet spot in terms of what the actual transaction fee should be. If the transaction fee goes too high, you're not going to be maximizing revenue to the miners because you're going to have less volume, right? So you'll have higher fees, but at lower volume,
right,
and you can have less revenue. Likewise, if your fees aren't high enough, you might have high volume but low fees, and you're still not maximizing revenue. So there is a sweet spot in terms of the price or the optimal transaction fee that will maximize revenue to the miners.
Right.
So if the goal is exclusively to maximize revenue to the miners, the BTC is not taking the right approach by just capping it at 1 megabyte, because they very well could run into a scenario where their total fee reward is less than it would be if they just lowered the fee by 10% or 20% or 50%. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
and had more capacity. So
they put themselves in a position to be kind of like the central planners of the mining reward of mining.
But see, so this is the broader problem, though, is that there's no mechanism that exists to allow miners to optimize that fee, right? Because what is needed is effectively you need a 51% cartel, centrally planning what the block size is going to be for each individual block, right? And basing that block size based on
Mm-hmm.
demand at that particular time. So
Well,
they somehow would.
what happens every time you, with Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV, we've seen that the miners calibrate, that they calibrate their capacity of what they can afford to have. And
well, I mean, what we have now in the situation in both Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV is there's so much extra block space that the only incentive for miners is to just take all transactions. And that results in fees being basically the bare minimum to relay, right? The minimum relay network fee. And I think that that's okay because we're still in the network building phase, right? So there's a marketing strategy out there that says when you're trying to build a company, you want to give away your product for as cheap as you possibly can, maybe even subsidize it in the early days to build that network effect. And then you can, start maybe raising prices later on in the future. But you need to grow as big as possible and grow your network effect as much as possible today. So you want to artificially hold prices low. And I think that that's a very appropriate strategy for Bitcoin today, Bitcoin Cash, BSV, is to keep transaction fees very low today and try and grow that volume and grow that user base. Right. I don't know if we're always going to want, fees that are 0.001 penny, I am not sure if that's going to be the optimum going forward. But again, we don't have an actual mechanism to dial the fee to the optimal amount for security purposes, right? That no such mechanism exists. So it seems like absent that mechanism, it just seems like you need to just try and grow volume as much as possible, right? In order to get the most fees. I mean, without some kind of coordinating mechanism to adjust the maximum block size block by block by block based on user demand, we don't have that.
Right. It seems as if the thing is, Chris, is that
the closest thing that we did have was Jeff Garzik proposed, I think, BIP 100, I believe, where miners could vote for a specific block size. And so that would at least give them some ability to target a particular fee level based on what they collectively felt was the optimal fee at that point in time. And I don't know, maybe that was a good approach. I don't know. It never happened.
Do you foresee a future where because obviously, look, man, we have 3 different approaches. You and I are partial to the fact that we don't think the approach that BTC is headed is a smart way of going about. My business partner, Mr. X, he loves BTC. He really loves Monero, but he's more partial to BTC, and he has his arguments. He has the BTC arguments for why it's a smart way to scale and so forth. Mm-hmm. Do you foresee a future where we're going to have miners abandon one of these chains? And in the future, do you foresee just miners consolidating hash power into one chain and
well, I don't think miners will ever abandon something that there's demand for. If users abandon one of the chains, the miners will abandon it. But I don't think miners are just going to say, I'm not going to mine that for whatever reason, because they'd be leaving profits on the table.
Well, what if it's just because my understanding, and I'm not going to name people or organizations, but my understanding is that if the proposal is good enough for a miner to switch from one to another, they will switch. And what I've been hearing is that it's around 5%. If mining another chain is 5% more profitable, miners will switch. Mm-hmm.
Well, what's going to make it 5% more profitable other than the price change?
Yeah, that's for people to figure out. That's for everyone to figure out. So I guess to conclude, what would be Bitcoin Cash's approach to this, and what are the projects that are you most excited for on the Bitcoin Cash blockchain?
Well, I don't think we know the long-term approach. I think our approach is to kind of take a wait and see approach as to what happens. I think the short-term approach is to do everything we can to try and increase transaction volume today and make the chain more useful. At some point, I mean, this is also, I mean, we can only do so much with technology. At some point, this is also marketing and goes into other fields. And you know, this is a problem faced by all cryptocurrencies too, not just Bitcoin Cash, right? Because we're still primarily driven by speculation at this point, not like real world usage. So figuring out a way to increase that real world usage is going to be difficult. My battery probably has like 1 minute left.
That's fine. So we're finishing up right on time, which is good.
Yeah. But in terms of projects, I kind of like the projects I've got going on. BCHd, there's this Neutrino wallet that's a new type of SPV wallet that has stronger privacy. There's the Cash Shuffle project that's going on. Some interesting stuff going on Electron Cash, some interesting plugins and stuff going on there.
Has Schnorr signatures, right?
Yeah. I mean, in the future, another thing we might want to do down the road is possibly signature aggregation across inputs, which would reduce the size of Bitcoin Cash transactions pretty substantially, which would also make it more scalable. I think that's where we'd ultimately like to go. And then possibly Avalanche too, if we get more people working on it.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for your time. Is there anything else you would want to say to this anarchist crowd?
No, I think we did it pretty good. Yeah.
What was that?
I think we're pretty good.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I hope to have you back sometime so we can talk more about Bitcoin Cash.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. And I know you're busy. And yeah, thank you so much, Chris. Have a good one.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.